This episode is produced with support from DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance.
Have you ever walked near woodlands or rain fed roads and heard a pleasing, sometimes deafening chorus of birds, frogs, and insect calls? Have you ever thought about what these creatures are trying to communicate? Are they calling for a mate? Or are they sounding an alarm? Or just discussing something else altogether? Listening into these conversations of birds and insects to make sense of them is what behavioral ecologist Manjari Jain does for a living. She researches the interface of ethology, ecology, and evolutionary biology. To be more precise, she studies acoustic communication in animals, decoding their language for us, so to speak. So, on this episode of the Nature India podcast series called I Am a Scientist and This Is Where I Work, join me, Subhra Priyadarshini, in understanding the environment's soundscape. We will travel today with Manjari Jain, an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Mohali. We will walk through her many places of work in the open skies, under the soil and muddy puddles, and inside dense forests. Manjari, so glad to catch up with you. Will you take us into your workplace, or in your case, all the exotic sounding places you work in?
Yes, so I have been very lucky to have worked in a variety of landscapes ranging from tropical deciduous forests, scrub jungles, evergreen forests, and now to urban parks and woodlands. Each landscape brings with itself a unique environment, a unique soundscape. We study how animals communicate with each other using sound. What do these sounds tell us? And how much information can the receivers extract from these sounds? So, my PhD work was in the dense tropical evergreen forests of Kudremukh, where we would enter the forest only after sunset and stay on till about midnight. We would record insects and bats. And as you can imagine, the forest at night is full of sounds, not so much sights. And given that we are in the tropics, this is a huge diversity of sound that you are going to be subjected to.
Jungle sounds, wow. So, like most of us with desk jobs or lab jobs, of course, you can't complain of monotony in your work. You wake up each day to a new experience. It must be so stimulating. But sometimes, is it intimidating?
For me, the first time when I entered the forest, it was overwhelming. The amount of noise that surrounded me, full of the chorus of insects, and it was only after a few months that I learned how to pay attention to individual sounds. Bats, on the other hand, as you know, use high frequency sounds, so we can't hear the bats, but we could often see the bats moving around. Now, my work is mostly in urban gardens, woodlands, and parks where we study common backyard birds to understand how much information can we extract from the sound with regards to the biodiversity that surrounds us.
Wow, intriguing. So, can you help us decode the sounds of insects and birds, their interactions and behavior, or the problems that they face in their environment?
The insects that I work on are nocturnal insects, that is, they are active at night time. These are crickets and katydids. Largely focuses on their behavior, but also on the evolution of their acoustic signals. Why are the calls shaped as they are for given species? Another important problem is what is known as the cocktail party problem. So imagine you are a cricket and you are calling from somewhere in the ground, and you are surrounded by other crickets of your own kind and of different species. The interesting thing that you must know is that only males can produce sound and the females are silent, but the females exercise choice as to which male they would mate with. So the males advertise using sound or serenade the females, and the females then respond to it by approaching the males in complete darkness just using the sound alone. But when all of this is happening in an orchestra of sound, it's going to be challenging for the male to pass on information without that information getting lost in sound, which is what we call as acoustic masking interference, where multiple sounds overlap with each other.
And what about my core area of interest in all of this? The birds?
With the birds, of course, and for this I use social babblers as the model system. There are several species of babblers in India. Some of them live in like a joint family, if you like, in these social groups, which are family units. The jungle babbler, that they do produce different kinds of sounds, and it is likely that these sounds carry some meaning. So we decoded the babbling of the babbler, and we now know what each sound means. We have characterized the acoustics of the bird's vocal repertoire. For instance, if a call is made up of multiple notes, tuck, 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 you have each note which could be of a unique kind. We ask if these calls are kind of randomly organized or is there ordering of these notes. So, just the way meaningful words that we use in human language, they have a certain order to it, right? And of course, we are interested in their social life. We want to understand how they coordinate their group activities using sound, but also how they what they do all day, and they produce certain kinds of calls when they are foraging, which are known as flight calls. And they start producing these flight calls when an individual starts to exhibit, wanting to move from that location. Also, how they take care of the young ones, parental care, brood parasitism in these birds.
That's a whole bunch of questions you're trying to answer. So, what kind of preparation do you have to do? Tell us a little bit about the gadgets you carry and the things you have in your backpack when you're at work.
Yeah. So for the insect work, since it is mostly in the night time, and for the bat work, you need to have a torch, headlamp, so that you can find your way, especially when you are in the forest. And at that time, also lead socks and boots, so that you can storm through vegetation without getting bitten by snakes. Since we work on sounds, we need a lot of battery backup. So many equipment, two laptops, battery, motor battery to power my speakers. For the bird work, on the other hand, we need to carry poles for mist netting, mist net, bands, color bands, vials to store certain kinds of samples. So, and table to prop this up to keep everything in place. So there's a lot of you have to be extremely organized.
Well, not just with tools and gears, but also preparing mentally to go into these ecosystems for long hours, to long days, and then waiting for these creatures in the dark, dense forests. And tell us about the mood, the setup, and then when you listen to these sounds, what's going on in your mind.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question because I don't know how to answer this without looking like a really scared little, I don't know, kitten. So when I first walked into Kudramukh, my heart sank because we are humans are very visual animals, and I just couldn't see anything. You cannot even see the stars because there's this massive canopy of trees, right? But your senses with respect what you can hear, you're overloaded there. And I could hear crickets and frogs and all kinds of eerie sounds everywhere. And there were calls of civets and lorises, which sound like someone is shrieking inside the forest, which all, relate to the very conventional notion of a forest being an extremely dangerous place. I would get extremely scared listening to some kinds of sounds.
That must have taken some getting used to, really. Birds communicate with vocal sounds or visual cues. On the other hand, frogs and toads have vocal cords. Chirping is how crickets communicate. These messages are used by birds and insects to find mates, then keep track of friends and family, then locate food. stay safe from predators, and then defend territories from rival birds. So, Manjari, it would be really interesting to hear some of the latest research findings from this extensive field work that you do, which of course needs tons of patience and determination.
So, the process of science is time consuming. There are very few moments of finding. It is a long drawn process. I will give you one example from my insect work and one example more recently from the bird work. So, with the insect work, when I entered the forest, it was just so noisy. There was a cacophony of sounds. And the first question that came to my mind, how do they communicate in this noise? So you can think of like an FM, so bands in the radio. You can tune into certain bands, and then whatever is happening in the other channel is not kind of, it doesn't interfere with your work, right? But the crickets, in combination with how their sounds are structured, wherein some sounds fall in the silent intervals of other species. If you look at one thing at a time, it doesn't make sense. It still sounds like a cacophony. But if you put all of these axes together, a holistic view, there is zero cacophony. So there is silence in this cacophony. And that was something absolutely fantastic, incredible for me. Of course, the animals are communicating, which means that clearly they are being able to overcome the masking problem. We just didn't know how. It was a great moment for me to figure out how they were actually avoiding masking. We worked on the sounds, vocalizations of purple sunbird, another very common backyard bird. The bird song is made up of phrases, and the phrases are made up of notes, which is something true for many songbirds. But what we found was there was ordering of these notes. There seems like certain kind of some kind of underlying rule which determines which note will be present in which position within a phrase. Or, in other words, there are certain kinds of linguistic laws which were thought to be followed only in primate species, but we have now found evidence for that in jungle babblers as well.
Ooh, purple sunbirds and jungle babblers linguistics. That does sound fascinating. Now, coming back to the rainforest, what kind of hurdles or unusual challenges do you come across while working there?
Yes, so the work I did in the rainforest was done in Kudremukh National Park. There has been a lot of conflict between the forest department and locals, a lot of unrest. We would be locked out of the forest because the checkposts have just shut down. There has been some conflict. People were displaced. With respect to risk from wild animals, it is not the carnivores usually that one needs to worry about, I think. It's large herbivores. So elephants were a problem, and there have been times when we had to just abandon our work and pack up everything and run because there has been an elephant around. So the next day when I arrived in the morning to check, we find that the one elephant had come and had stomped around the entire quadrant, crushing our plastic stools. It was really unhappy that we were there, and it had defecated all over our quadrat. So that really kind of freaked me out a bit. Although I must emphasize that the risk from wild animals, in my opinion, was far less than the risk of getting involved in some kind of conflict between the administration and the locals. I would say that difficulty was far more serious to me than the presence of wild animals, which is what most people associate working in forest to be risky for.
Of course, one can understand why you would consider that risky. In your research spanning almost 2 decades, trying to understand birds and insects better, do you see any change in yourself as a person?
So initially, it was extremely frustrating. Every time I would hear the babbler, I would just go crazy. I would see that there is distinctive behavior. So obviously, when you walk through the garden, this is the flight call. So they're going to move from here. This one is left behind. It's calling for its group member. So there's this sense of, joy and happiness, which cannot be described. Yeah.
Well, back to nature is an in thing these days. And this research discipline takes you closer to nature in every possible way. Do you think that might appeal to youngsters who'd like to choose an unusual science stream? What would you tell young researchers?
The first thing I will tell is I have talked about some of the limitations, dangers of working in this kind of field, but these are what I would say occupational hazards, and these are there even for the most seemingly safe work environments. So come to this field only if you are mentally ready for this. The other thing that nobody talks about is the isolation that you will feel in these forests and landscapes where we have most of our field stations. It can really affect you, affect your mental health. So be aware of this. It's a marathon and not a sprint.
Absolutely. Most people would think of their workplace as a place with set working hours, clean toilets, and coffee vending machines. That's a far cry for Manjari, for whom an entire biodiverse ecosystem is her workplace. And about this workplace, she continues to create awareness through public outreach and nature education. If you liked what you heard on this episode of the Nature India podcast, share it with friends and colleagues and check out our archives for more in both English and Hindi. We'll meet again soon with another fascinating episode of I Am a Scientist and This Is Where I Work. Thanks for tuning in. I am your host, Subhra Priyadarshini, and this is the Nature India podcast.
This episode was produced with support from DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance.